This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
This is a proclamation guaranteeing the state's protection against invasion based on the current crisis at the southern border. It invokes various executive powers relating to the ongoing invasion at the southern border.
Prominent in President Donald Trump's executive orders signed hours after taking office were a flood of actions on immigration, from declaring a national emergency at the southern border and barring asylum to cracking down on undocumented immigrants already in the country and cutting off birthright citizenship, a right enshrined in the Constitution. Before the ink was barely dry on the order ending birthright citizenship, the first lawsuits against the administration were filed by Democratic-led states and immigration advocates.
I have one message for President Trump. I'll see you in court.
Joining me is an expert in immigration law, Leon Fresco. Leon, he declared a national emergency at the southern border, and he wants to send troops down there. What are the parameters for using the military within the country?
So this has always been an area of considerable legal debate. There is no doubt of any kind that troops can be sent there for a observation capacity in terms of pointing out to domestic law enforcement officials, hey, there's someone we've observed crossing, go apprehend them. Now, as to whether the troops have actual apprehension authority, this is always debated under posse comitatus, where the issue is whether you could have the military enforce domestic law inside the border of the United States. President Trump and his administration are trying to say what we're trying to do is prevent an invasion. We're not trying to actually enforce domestic law. We're trying to prevent people from invading us. And so that issue will be one of first impression if you actually want to litigate this issue of whether military people should actually be the individuals making arrests at the border. I don't think they're necessary given how few people are crossing at the moment. So it would be more of an intimidation factor just to have the people there. And certainly they can have the people there to create that intimidation factor. But whether they actually can be the ones who conduct the arrest, that's the open legal question.
Does National Guard fit under the umbrella?
Correct. National Guard has the same problem as the actual military. And so National Guard always gets sent to the border, and then what happens is they get sent there, they hold their guns, they create an intimidation factor, they point people out to be arrested by the CBP and ICE, but they don't actually conduct any immigration law enforcement. And that's been the way that has been settled for quite a bit of time. But the question is what would happen now subsequently if they actually want to have this debate about, well, what if what we want the military to do is actually to repel an invasion? What are we permitted to do? And I mean, in that world, you could shoot at people trying to come across the border, because if you actually think they're invading you, well, you're right. But I mean, that's the question the courts are going to have to grapple with at that point.
Let's turn to the issue of asylum and refugees. So he signed a proclamation to end the asylum process. Is that within his purview to end the asylum process?
So this has been the issue that's been in litigation since the first Trump administration. And then the Biden administration reversed the first Trump administration's attempt to ban asylum. And then near the end of the Biden administration attempted to ban asylum, albeit with two caveats that were supposed to distinguish it from the Trump administration. The first one is something that was eliminated yesterday, which was a very big deal, called the CBP One app. And so what is the CBP One app? I think this is something I've heard a lot about on TV and on other podcasts where people misunderstand what's going on. The CBP One app is an app that all it's doing is it's organizing in a coordinated manner the process by which foreign nationals appear at ports of entry along the southern border to ask for asylum. So I've heard people say, oh, no, this is just ending illegal asylum or whatever else. No. This is ending the actual thing that people are saying that you can still theoretically do, which is go to the port of entry and ask for asylum. So the whole point of the CBP-1 app is, instead of having people just show up there willy-nilly and create chaos, give people an appointment and have them show up in a coordinated fashion. Well, that was ended. And so that was going to be a main defense to we don't have an asylum ban. What we have is a coordinated system where you can ask for asylum at the ports of entry. No, we don't. That's gone. And so now the question is, can you actually have an asylum ban? And we're back to this issue that we've spoken about in prior podcasts, which is this is an issue in which there is tension between two different statutes. One statute says you cannot have an asylum ban. It's the actual asylum statute, which says that you're allowed to apply for asylum no matter how you entered the country. And then there's another statute which gives discretion to limit the factors of which one can obtain asylum. And so the question is, yes, but can one of those factors that are a discretionary factor be illegal crossing when there's another statute that specifically says you can apply for asylum even if there's an illegal crossing? And so those are the two statutes that are in tension, and we need to get to the Supreme Court to figure out which statute wins. We certainly can have a scenario where, for instance, you put in a discretionary factor where you say, oh, we're denying anyone asylum who's ever participated with the Tren de Agua gang in Venezuela. That's fine. You can do that. That certainly makes sense, and I don't think any court would overturn that. But can you have a wholesale asylum ban as a discretionary factor for crossing? I don't think that's going to be permitted, because then what's the whole point of the other statute which says that you can apply for asylum regardless of if you crossed illegally? But I don't know. I think this is going to be a close call in the Supreme Court, 5-4 either way, and we'll have to see.
An immigration advocacy group took legal action against the move to end the CBP-1 app, filing a motion for emergency status in D.C. District Court. And the lawyer representing the ACLU, Lee Gallant, said whether or not Trump enacts additional border policies, the termination of the CBP-1 appointment process means there is now no way for anyone to seek asylum at the border, even for families.
Correct. So this was the case, the one in D.C., was the case where the Biden asylum restrictions were being challenged, because what happened was they had to challenge it in D.C. based upon a previous Supreme Court ruling that happened in the Biden administration, which said if you want to challenge these things, there's no nationwide injunctions that you can get in a specific case like this. You have to go, district by district, and you have to have specific statutory authority. So they had to go to D.C. because there's an actual statute which talks about when you're doing this kind of asylum ban in what's called the expedited removal process, you have to challenge anything in that process in D.C. So they went to D.C. in the Biden administration. They've gone for a full summary judgment, not an injunction, because there's some question about whether a court can issue an injunction. So they said, forget about that. Let's just ask for summary judgment saying that the Biden asylum regulations were illegal. That was about to be decided, but now we have the Trump asylum regulations, which are even more stringent than the Biden asylum regulations, or rather executive orders is what they both are. And so in this situation, what the ACLU is saying is you have to take whatever you were going to do under Biden, which we thought was illegal, and add the Trump parts, which were taking away the mitigating defenses of what Biden was saying, because what Biden was saying is, yes, we have asylum, but it has to be at the port of entry organized under CBP-1, and we should be allowed to do that. We should be allowed to have an organized process where people ask for asylum. But if you actually take away the organized process part and you have no process, it appears to me that it would be easier for the ACLU to win the litigation, but we'll have to wait and see.
Let's talk about deportations. In his speech, he said, we'll begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came. And when he was signing orders in the Oval Office, they asked him about whether there would be raids. And he said, there have to be raids. I'm not telling you when, but there have to be. I mean, what does he intend as far as deportations?
Well, in terms of the actual operations, we're still not at the point where you're seeing those on X or Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever. We're not at that point yet. But what we are going to likely see are operations where there are known individuals who already have final orders of removal or who already have basically criminal convictions that allow them to have a very quick order of removal. We know about the criminal conviction. We haven't put them through the immigration process. Those people, there's going to be some home operations, but actually what you're going to see more of is operations in places like workplaces and other public places, so that it creates a larger ripple effect of people getting worried about where can I go and not be subject to an operation. And the idea is that that would encourage people to self-deport because they would be nervous that they might be subject to an operation. But those operations, in order to make sure it's not just people you're holding and you're not going to be able to remove, are limited still to people with criminal convictions or prior orders of removal. And so that's where people have to understand that ICE is operating under some constraints there.
He's expected to give new authority to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection officers to carry out deportations.
Yes. So here's what that is. So there is a statute called the Expedited Removal Statute, which says that if you are within 100 miles of the U.S. border, which, believe it or not, actually covers a very large portion of the country, because that's any border, any water border, any land border. So the northern border, the western ocean, the eastern ocean, the southern ocean. You take 100 miles in any direction, and you're within the area where you could be subject to expedited removal. And so if you are within 100 miles of any border, plus you've been here less than 2 years, then the government doesn't need to take you through the normal removal process where there's a hearing, and that hearing is 6 years from now because there's a 1 million-person backlog in immigration court. They can just literally give you an order, put you on the plane, and take you out, unless you say that you need asylum, and then you have to have a credible fear that you establish, and if not, they can take you out. Now, the Biden administration and other administrations have limited that authority to 14 days as opposed to 2 years. They self-limited that because what they're trying to say is, look, we're trying to limit this to people we literally see coming across the border, because how will we know if someone's been here 2 years or not? That's going to create a lot of litigation. That's going to create problems. If we can actually show, hey, Agent Smith observed this person coming across, then that's one thing. But if we can't actually do that, then how do we know they haven't been here 2 years? And that's where you start having this very problematic situation where you start reinserting potential areas of litigation that had been actually ruled in favor of the government. So right now the government has pretty expansive authorities on expedited removal where they can't be challenged in federal court. But if they start getting into this scenario where a bunch of people start saying, oh, I've been here for more than 2 years and you're trying to deport me, then if the government is deemed to be abusing this may reopen. The courts may say, well, wait a second, we need a vehicle where people can challenge this. And then that same vehicle can start getting used to challenge other parts of the expedited removal process. So that's why people haven't wanted to open that door. But if the Trump administration says, look, we want to reopen that door and we're fine doing it and we have the best environment we've ever had in the courts to do this in, then it's possible that they may actually, they will give themselves the authority, but whether they actually start implementing this in practice and saying, look, we think this person's been here for 1 year and 6 months, so we can just grab them and immediately put them on a plane and not have to give them any due process, that's going to be very interesting to see if that happens.
Speaking about putting them on a plane, where can they put them on a plane to at this point?
That's another question, is there's going to have to be countries that are willing to accept them. I just read earlier today on Bloomberg News, which is obviously the best news source that there is, about India saying that it's going to work with the United States to repatriate people that weren't previously being repatriated to India. And so that's one example where sort of President Trump has this mythical ability to bend reality to his will. And India wasn't accepting these people previously, and so now it may accept them. And certainly President Trump has been threatening other countries who don't accept U.S. deportees that they will create all kinds of other sanctions on them. And so if that works, if the India example is one example of this, then we may see others where President Trump ends up being very successful. getting countries to accept people that we're trying to deport that we previously weren't successful in having that happen.
Coming up, the lawsuits against Trump's order ending birthright citizenship. This is Bloomberg. On his first day in office, President Donald Trump signed sweeping executive actions designed to crack down on illegal border crossings and target undocumented migrants already in the country. One of his high-profile orders was to end birthright citizenship, which says children born in the United States are U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. That order led to Democratic state attorneys general and immigration advocates launching the first suits against the Trump administration. New Jersey Attorney General Matt Platkin says he's confident that order is never going to take effect because it's so clearly unconstitutional.
The reason why you put something in the Constitution, the reason why we talk about rule of law, this is not an abstract concept. It's so that a president, Congress, the majority cannot simply change a right on a whim. This is a right that was codified in one of the most important amendments ever codified in our nation's nearly 2.5-century history.
I've been talking to immigration law expert Leon Fresco. This before because Trump has been promising to end birthright citizenship for some time. So tell us about this executive order.
Previously, we talked about it in the theoretical. Now we actually have the executive order. And the executive order is actually not very detailed. So what it just says is, in 30 days, the administration is to not give the accoutrement of citizenship, meaning passport, social security numbers, etc., to people who are born in the United States unless one of their parents is either a citizen or a lawful permanent resident, period. If this executive order is not enjoined by the court, then what would happen is any future person applying for a U.S. passport, for instance, you would need to show that not just you were born here, which is all you have to show now. You just show your birth certificate, which is given to you by the hospital. Now that wouldn't be enough. You would need to show a birth certificate either before February 20th, 2025. That would be one way. Or you would need to show a birth certificate after February 20th of 2025 and proof of one of your parents' green cards or one of their passports or one of their birth certificates, something of that nature. And the question is, will that actually be implemented? And here is where we go to the legal theory, which is that under the 14th Amendment very clearly says anybody born here is a U.S. citizen unless you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. laws. And that was done as part of the 14th Amendment in order to end slavery, where people who were born here were allowed to be slaves and didn't have the full rights of citizenship. So the 14th Amendment ended that and said everybody born here has the full rights of citizenship. No one can be given a second-class citizenship that can lead them to be put into slavery or some other second-class status. And so from that standpoint, the only way to eliminate birthright citizenship without changing the Constitution is to make a determination that people who are born here that you're trying to eliminate this from are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Well, that's what this executive order says, but is that really true? I mean, that would mean that they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. I actually tweeted earlier today, I said, for the moment, if you are a criminal defense attorney and you have a client in federal court and they are not a green card holder or they are not a U.S. citizen, then you, I think, would be very close to committing malpractice if you don't file a motion to dismiss saying that at the moment, the current administration believes that my client is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning we can't criminally prosecute this person because they're not subject to our jurisdiction. And so that is an unintended consequence here. And is that really something that the administration is comfortable with? I really don't know. And I don't know how you can make someone subject to the jurisdiction for crimes, but not subject to the jurisdiction for citizenship. That word either means what it means or it doesn't, which means typically diplomatic immunity. So diplomats and their children are usually the ones interpreted under this statute and this constitutional provision to be the ones exempted from birthright citizenship, but not anyone else.
Democratic attorneys general filed 2 sets of lawsuits to strike down this executive order. Tell us about the grounds for their lawsuits.
Their argument is that this cannot be changed via an executive order, that there's a constitutional provision and actually a statute which codifies the constitutional provision. So there's actually 2 different legal authorities here, and that both of them mean that the only people exempt from this are diplomats and the children of diplomats. It's not other people. And so the executive order would be ultra virus. And so they're all representing that they have people in their state or in their organization, et cetera, that are going to have children after February 20th of 2025. And those children will not have U.S. citizenship, so they will be harmed by this. And then some of the interesting arguments they make is there are some countries where if you're born in another country, you might be considered stateless. They may not give you their citizenship either. And so what are these poor kids supposed to do? They'll end up being stateless. This is, by the way, not just a problem for people who are undocumented. The way the executive order is written, again, it will be the children of anybody who doesn't have a green card or a U.S. passport, meaning there's millions of people here on other kinds of work visas that their children will not have U.S. citizenship if they're born here, which previously was the case, which will mean that if those people want to stay in the U.S. ultimately, those children will be in a limbo where it's not clear what their citizenship status will be.
The Supreme Court affirmed birthright citizenship in one case way back in 1898. And it seems like the Democratic AGs have a good case against this executive order.
If I were a chat GPT or a computer judge or an AI judge or a robot judge, I would put the statistical odds of this being enjoined at a very, very high numerical percentage. But because human beings are involved and you just never know, you can never say for sure that you are certain that this won't get enjoined. But I do think it will very likely to get enjoined in the lower court and in the courts of appeals. And then the question is, if this goes to the Supreme Court, would there really be 5 judges that say you can overturn birthright citizenship via an executive order? And I'm very skeptical of that, but since one can never guarantee anything, you just never know.
One of his orders targets sanctuary cities that refuse to cooperate with ICE by restricting federal funds and potentially taking legal action against them. During his first administration, weren't there legal actions related to his
Correct.
view?
What happened was there were these initiatives to take away DOJ police funding and other detention funding and other federal funding that had to do with law enforcement from cities that did not report when they had people arrested who were not in status to the federal government. Those are what's called sanctuary cities or states are places where if there's a foreign national who's arrested, those foreign nationals aren't reported to ICE. And that they don't let ICE go into the jails to determine if there's foreign nationals in there that can be removed when their prison sentences or their jail terms are up. And so the point was, if you're not going to allow ICE to do that, you shouldn't get federal funding for police. Those cases were litigated, and pretty much the states and the cities won in those litigations. But that was because they were executive orders like these were. What will be interesting is that now that there is control over the Congress, and we're seeing things like the Lake and Riley Act passed with some Democratic help, can you actually get 60 votes, meaning there would be some Democratic support for the principle that a sanctuary city should have their grants taken away? Because there, once it's not just an executive order, but it's Congress actually limiting funds to localities that it is appropriating, then the claims are going to be much harder to win in litigation by the states and the cities. So for now, if it's executive orders, yes, the point is being made. There will be the same litigation. The litigation is likely to be successful, and the refusal to give the funding will be overturned. But the long-term battle here is going to be, will there be bipartisan votes for actually eliminating funding to sanctuary cities?
He has one order that instructs federal agencies to identify countries that don't provide sufficient information about their citizens for the U.S. to be able to vet and screen them.
Yes. That is the old travel ban statute, if you remember that.
That would be hard to forget.
Last time in the first Trump administration, there was the ban first, and then all the questions were asked later. And so that's what led to a lot of litigation. And then finally, after many iterations of the ban, the final ban was upheld because the questions were asked first, and then the final ban was written. So this time, they agreed, let's ask the questions first, let's do the investigation, then we'll come back and do the ban. And so they're going to ask the questions first, which countries are unsafe, or we don't know who is who, or when we get information from them, this could all be fake or whatever. And then if we can figure out which country should go on a list like that, then there will be a travel ban put in place for people from those countries.
Also, he wants to complete the building of the wall along the Mexico-U.S. border. How much wall was built and how much has to be built?
Well, again, this depends on what you consider wall and what will be the final product, and you consider barriers that are there now that are not wall-like barriers to be considered part of the wall. So all of this is in the eye of the beholder. But let's say that without any controversy of any kind, there's at least 500 miles that are completely wide open. And then there's another 500 or so miles that have some kind of substandard barrier that probably President Trump, if he were talking about the big, beautiful wall, would not think that that would qualify because it would be traversable barriers that might be there to prevent vehicles or something of that nature, but not to prevent an industrious person from traversing the wall. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done. There's been litigation on this. You can declare a national emergency. You can repurpose the military funds for the wall. And then the only thing that had happened in the prior administration was all of that got decided way too late. And so by the time the money started being used, the administration was over. So now the point is start on day one. And the idea is, well, then hopefully by the end of the administration, you would have your 2,000-mile complete wall of the southern border. And so that's the intent. That's what they say they're going to do. Let's see what actually happens over the next 4 years.
I have a feeling there is going to be a lot of litigation over immigration issues. Thanks so much, Leon. That's Leon Fresco, a partner at Holland & Knight. Coming up next on the Bloomberg Law Show, Trump gives TikTok a reprieve. What does it mean? I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg. President Donald Trump temporarily halted the ban on TikTok in the U.S., granting the company and its Chinese parent ByteDance a 75-day reprieve to reach a deal for the popular app that would resolve national security concerns. TikTok's lifeline came in an executive order signed by Trump on Monday in one of his first acts after taking office. His stance is that American companies should own half of the wildly popular app.
The U.S. should be entitled to get half of TikTok. And congratulations, TikTok has a good partner. And that would be worth, could be $500 billion or something. It's crazy. The numbers are crazy. But it's worthless if the president doesn't sign, then it's worthless.
Joining me is First Amendment expert Dr. Kirk McGill of Hall Estel. So tell us about Trump's order granting TikTok this reprieve for 75 days.
So the order is exactly what you just said. It simply says, I, President Trump, with the authority I claim under the law, hereby extend for 75 days the ban on TikTok, and I encourage all companies, for example, Google and Apple in their stores, to allow TikTok to continue to operate during that period, and I promise not to send you to jail if you do that. Signed, Donald Trump.
Does he have the authority to issue that kind of executive order? Because according to the TikTok ban, the law, an extension is only possible if he can show Congress that there's a viable path forward to make a deal.
Likely he does not have the legal authority under the statute, strictly speaking. But the question is anybody going to be able to do anything about it in those 75 days? The court system works rather slowly. So is anyone going to have standing to go stop him from doing that that's going to be able to get a judge to put a stop to it within that 75-day period? Clearly, he's betting that they are not.
So he sort of shrugged off the national security concerns around TikTok, which was the ostensible reason for the ban, saying the U.S. has bigger problems than any threat of China potentially getting information about young kids.
So Trump, of course, is playing a game here, which is he's trying to get a deal done. He's very open about saying that. And so he's trying to deliver a message to China of, I'm your friend, I'm the good cop, I'm the one that can get a deal done here, because the alternative is a U.S. Congress that voted overwhelmingly for banning you, and you couldn't get that many members of Congress to agree on what day of the week it is, much less on what constitutes a national security threat. So the fact that they all walked out of those classified briefings and voted overwhelmingly for banning TikTok sets them up very much as the bad cop in this deal-making. And so Trump seems to be brushing off those national security implications, not because he isn't aware of them and doesn't respect them, but rather because he's trying to set himself up to be the deal maker. And this is a man who's written an entire book about how he tries to make deals. This is pretty much par for how he tries to make deals. He's either the good cop or the bad cop, and he's set himself up in this one to be either one. He's certainly cautioned China that he's aware of the national security implications and that any deal that gets done is going to have to protect Americans. So he's set himself up to be able to play whichever side he needs to in order to get a deal done, assuming there's one to be had.
He said, I could see a deal where the U.S. gets 50% of TikTok, polices it a little bit or a lot, depends on them. Do you see a deal like that anywhere?
I don't think I see a deal in which the United States government is going to own a major institution of public communication. That simply has so many First Amendment implications that the lawyers at the Justice Department will probably all walk out and start having a group cry in the parking lot if he actually was serious about doing that. I don't think he's serious about doing it. Now, trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do, let's all admit, is an exercise in guessing at best. But if I had to guess, I would say that's simply all part of his game. Ultimately, what he wants is he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants TikTok to be able to survive in some form because it would get him a large amount of political support from all of the TikTok users who say, yay, Donald Trump saved TikTok. At the same time, he's not a fool. He's got national security people talking about it to him to explain just how dangerous TikTok is and its information collection could be to America in the future, particularly with people who aren't necessarily aware of what they're giving up. Teenagers, people that aren't even on TikTok, but whose information is being provided to TikTok through, for example, access to the phone book of people who are on TikTok, and the kind of danger that can pose in the future to the United States and to our national security. So he's trying to balance those things out. And ultimately, the only way to do that is to not have China own TikTok. And that's what Congress decided. That's what the courts have ultimately upheld. And that is certainly what his national security experts are going to be telling him. What he's trying to find out is, can I have that cake and eat it too? Can I keep TikTok in one piece and functional in the United States, but do so in a way that takes it out of the control of China? China obviously doesn't want to let him do that. So he's playing a game of brinksmanship with them. And that's why we're seeing things like, for example, him coming out and saying maybe he'll put 100% tariff on China's goods if the deal isn't being made. That's all the kind of brinksmanship that Trump loves and in many cases has been successful at in forcing other countries to come to the bargaining table. Whether he's going to be successful here or not, that remains to be seen.
Let me ask you this about the security threat. Is it just a prospective threat? There's been no public information that they've accessed anyone's data or engaged in any propaganda on TikTok. Is it a concern about what might happen?
In the publicly available information, it is primarily about what could theoretically be done by China as opposed to what has been done. But we know there's this large trough of classified information that's not publicly available that Congress had access to, but that no one else has had access to. The theory, and this, of course, is just a theory, is that anything about actual use of that information would be in that classified file because it could give away our sources and methods. In other words, if we say, hey, we know that China used this information because in this meeting on this date, these Chinese officials did that, well, by definition, we're giving away our methods, or at least risking our methods of how did we get that information? Did we breach them electronically? Did we have an agent in the room? How did we get that information? And so that's not the kind of thing the United States government would want to be publicly known. I think we have to rely on the fact, again, that Congress came out of those meetings with sufficient concern to vote so overwhelmingly for the ban. that would suggest that whatever they saw, it posed a sufficient danger to the United States that they were able to come to an overwhelming agreement on the TikTok law, when, again, those same individuals couldn't agree on almost anything else in the universe right now.
ByteDance has previously said that it has no intention of divesting. I mean, do you see any movement there?
I think Trump's plan, and again, I'm guessing on a man who likes to not make it easy to guess what he's doing. That's part of his negotiation strategy. But I'm guessing that this is the plan. China doesn't want to divest TikTok. Trump's betting, however, if the choice is between not having TikTok and any money associated with it at all, having it be simply something you spent a bunch of money on and now you can't use in relation to your biggest competitor, or selling it to the United States, they'll sell. So if he's able to put his foot down and say, your choices, China, are not operating TikTok under the control of China. Your choices are, we'll pay you fair value for that, and you can let us operate it. So you lose the spying aspect, but you at least make some money off of it. Or we'll shut you down completely in accordance with the law, in which case not only will you not get your spying, but you also won't get any money. And you've sunk a huge amount of money into TikTok, and you're just going to eat that. And that seems to be the game that he's playing with him, is he's betting if the choice is between money and no money, that the issue of whether they operate or not is off the table. They're not going to be allowed to operate under Chinese control, that the Chinese will take the money and run. And whether or not that's true or not, we'll see, but it's at least a rational move to be making on his part to back them into that corner.
One prospective ownership group led by billionaire real estate investor Frank McCourt is proposing to buy TikTok without that recommendation algorithm. Isn't that algorithm what makes TikTok so popular?
Arguably, yes. The question is could you take the brand, in essence, and all of the current users of TikTok and develop an algorithm that's sufficiently good that you wouldn't go lose all of those users? McCourt seems to be betting the answer is yes, that they would be able to do that. The key seems to be of that deal is if I have a captive audience, I have those 170 million Americans that are using TikTok, how many of those are going to go jump ship just because the algorithm may not be as good as the one that it's replacing? And he's betting not enough to make it not worth what he's willing to pay for it.
So despite Trump's talking about this 50-50 deal, House Speaker Mike Johnson said on Sunday that there must be full divestiture from the Chinese Communist Party. Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Tom Cotton said in a post on X there was no legal basis for any kind of extension. But do you think that Trump can get this Congress, to do what he wants?
I don't think he's going to have a lot of success in getting Congress to back off on the divestiture, because that's the whole point. Keeping the Chinese government out of TikTok is the point of the statute, either divest or be banned. And there's such overwhelming support for that. Does Trump really want to burn his capital with Congress on that issue? The problem, to some extent, is Trump has put himself in a corner. I think quite knowingly he's taken on the risk. But if he had done nothing, then 100% of the blame could rightly have been put on Congress and on President Biden. President Biden unquestionably had the statutory authority to extend the time they had before the ban kicked in. He chose not to do that. Congress, of course, passed the original law. So Trump really had no responsibility for TikTok up until Sunday night. But as soon as he came in and said, I'm now extending this time, I'm going to go save TikTok, and not just doing that on the campaign trail, but doing it as president in an executive order, if TikTok now goes dark because Trump isn't able to get a deal done, then TikTok, when you try to log into TikTok, it's not going to say what it says right now, which is we've been saved by Donald Trump. It's going to say this is all Donald Trump's fault. So the Chinese government is unquestionably aware of the fact that they have that leverage. And if I was giving advice to the Chinese government rather than Donald Trump, I'd be telling him to use that. He's just put himself in the crosshairs of 170 million American TikTok users. Make him eat it. And again, Trump's not a fool. He knows he's put himself in that position, and he seems to be betting that he's going to be able to get a deal done that's satisfactory to everybody. If he does that, I think he's going to reap the political reward of that. If he doesn't do that, he's going to reap the political consequences. Either he's going to have to go try to get Congress to back off on something that Congress feels very strongly about from a national security perspective, which burns his political capital with Congress, or he's going to go have to tick off a bunch of TikTok users, unintended, around the country. And so he's playing a very high-stakes game of chicken, but this is a man who's made his entire career out of playing a high-stakes game of chicken. Donald Trump doesn't believe in the no-win scenario. He believes in the, immovable object against the unstoppable force, that in fact something's got to give and it's not going to be him. And whether or not he can pull that off in this case, I haven't a clue. And anybody who says that they do either is lying or has gotten personal assurances from a higher power on what's going to happen, because I couldn't put odds on this of how it's going to come out. I can tell you it's going to be interesting to watch, and I can tell you that we've got two very motivated powers in Trump for the United States and China, who both have a lot at stake at this issue and want to see this work out in a particular way. The difference is the Chinese Communist Party ultimately is looking for an outcome that's acceptable to them, whereas Trump has to deal with the democratic forces of our country, public opinion, Congress. There are a lot more moving parts for him than there are in China.
And 75 days goes by pretty quickly. Thanks so much for being on the show. That's Dr. Kirk McGill of Hall Estel. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcasts. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.